Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 391. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today, joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well. Happy to have you back on. And got a lot of news to get into today, so just want to quickly remind people to share the show. Host at the Libertarian Institute. Connor has a couple great articles out at the Institute this week that we'll be talking about on the show. Of course, I'm writing in the news section most days. And of course, we're putting out about 3 shows a week of conflicts of interest. So plenty of content going up at the Libertarian Institute. So be sure to keep your eye on what's happening there, whether that's by following the Twitter account. You can subscribe on Substack to get all the news articles. Lots of different ways to follow. And then, of course, you can, find the show on antiwar.com in the blog section. And with that, Connor, let's get into the show. I got a few articles that I wrote for the Institute to talk about today. This is probably the most significant. Most frontline Ukrainian soldiers killed within 4 hours. A retired Marine fighting in Ukraine told ABC News the front lines are a meat grinder where soldiers survive an average of 4 hours. Troy Offenbecker is fighting alongside Ukrainian forces in the Donbass region. Moscow and Kiev have been battling around Bakhmut for several months as Russian forces have slowly made gains around the city. In January, Germany estimated Kiev was losing a 3-digit number of soldiers daily fighting for Bakhmut. At the time, the White House believed President Zelensky was committing too many lives and resources to defend the city. Offenbecker's commentary suggests the situation may be getting worse for Ukrainian soldiers. It's been pretty bad on the ground, a lot of casualties. He assessed the life expectancy for a soldier is around 4 hours on the front line. And so, I did see some people say, well, obviously this can't be true because there's 50,000 Ukrainians fighting in Bakhmut. So that I think this guy is probably talking about, the few hundred or thousands of soldiers that are actually on the very, tip of the spear kind of front lines, the ones actively fighting. And so, that would put it in line and make it just worse, I think, than probably what Germany was assessing months ago, that they could be looking at thousands a day in Bakhmut. As the White House has acknowledged they're spending a lot of lives there. And also the fighting has significantly upticked in recent weeks, and Russia has taken more territory and I think opened up more fighting areas around the city. So he said the Russian attack on the city is not letting up and had turned into a meat grinder. The artillery is nonstop. Offenbecker explained the Russian forces are fighting around the clock. The Russians have maybe run into a shortage of shells lately, but the past couple of weeks has been nonstop all day and night, he told ABC. Meanwhile, Kiev's Western backers have expressed to Zelensky in recent weeks that NATO countries are struggling to find artillery shells to send to Ukraine. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the U.S. will train Ukrainian forces on fighting methods that use fewer munitions. The Kremlin ordered the mobilization of 300,000 troops last year. Western leaders have anticipated Moscow will order an offensive this winter. Ukrainian officials say that the Russian offensive is now underway, and Offenbecker agrees. With the amount of shelling, the amount of armor they've brought in, I think it's started, he explained to ABC. Due to Moscow and Kiev's tight control over their country's presses, it is unclear how substantial the death toll for each country is. Since the start of the war, Zelensky has nationalized Ukraine's media, outlawed his political opposition, and jailed citizens who oppose his administration. Commenting on the state of journalism in Ukraine, press leader Shadri Guz explained, "We never know what the basis of these accusations, what the pro-Russian link. It starts to look like political accusations rather than genuine crime. A lot of journalists self-censor now," he added. So, and I'm sure it's much the same in Russia, where we really don't get figures coming from the government. And of course, there is some censorship of the media there and a lot of state-run media in Russia. Next up, this article from Day to Camp. Moscow blames Ukraine for a series of drone attacks inside Russia. Russian authorities on Tuesday reported a series of Ukrainian drone attacks across the country, including one that fell within 60 miles southeast of Moscow, hundreds of miles from the Ukrainian border. A Russian official said the Ukrainian drone near Moscow attempted to target a gas facility. According to pictures of the wreckage, it was a Ukrainian-made drone that could fly up to 500 miles. Drone incidents were also reported along the Bryansk and Belgorod oblasts, which border Ukraine. In those two regions, authorities said one Ukrainian drone was shot down and 3 other drone attacks were reported, including one that flew through an apartment building. There were no casualties in any of the incidents, but they could reflect a stepped up effort by Ukraine to launch more attacks inside of Russia. And Connor, I think this is most concerning because I think the more attacks you see within Russia, the more that Russia is going to escalate the war and carry out significant attacks in Ukraine, including on civilian infrastructure. Not that that necessarily justifies it, but as a reality of war, Ukrainian escalations will likely be met with escalations from Moscow. Next up, article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute, Afghan Inspector General warns U.S. likely to repeat mistakes in Ukraine. The Inspector General for Afghan War said the White House is replicating its failed Afghan war policies in Ukraine on Tuesday. John Sopko, Inspector General for the Afghan Reconstruction, SIGAR, warned about American-made weapons falling into the wrong hands. I'm not super optimistic that we are going to learn our lesson, he told reporters. I've been in Washington since 1982, and learning lessons is not in our DNA in the United States, unfortunately. Sopko discussed the new weapons transfers to Ukraine in a report submitted to Congress. In the report, he wrote, "There is an understandable desire amid a crisis to focus on getting money out the door and to worry about oversight later, but too often that creates more problems than it solves. Given the ongoing conflict and the unprecedented volume of weapons being transferred to Ukraine, the risk of some equipment ending up on the black market or in the wrong hands is likely unavoidable." In a separate interview with Fox News, Sopko said, "We're spending a heck of a lot of money in that country, and anytime you spend that much money in a country, you're bound to get wastage. You're bound to get corrupt elements, not only of the Ukrainian or the host government, but also of the U.S. government contractors or other third-party contractors to try to steal the money. There's just so much money going in, it's hard to keep track of." The Department of Defense says it has inspectors in Ukraine. In testimony to Congress on Tuesday, the Pentagon's Undersecretary for Policy, Colin Powell, said that the White House allows Kiev to track the weapons. Ukraine tracks the arms with scanners provided by Washington, and the data is transferred to American officials at the embassy in Kiev. The head of SIGAR office explained that in Afghanistan, the misuse of American assistance contributed to the fall of the Kabul government. The U.S. attempted to build over 2 decades in the country. Without sufficient oversight, aid gets stolen or diverted to local oligarchs or politicians, or just the average Ukrainian will see waste. Sopko said the result would mean the loss of support for the Ukrainian government by the average Ukrainian who's fighting, dying, and bleeding on the front. And that's what we saw in Afghanistan. And we, the donors, the U.S., were identified as supporting corrupt oligarchs. Sopko warned that the weapons transfers can be counterproductive if the arms get stolen. The very worst outcome is the assistance gets diverted, stolen in such a way that it doesn't accomplish its intended purpose. In his remarks to Congress, Kyle asserted the Pentagon was confident American weapons sent to Ukraine were not ending up on the black market in significant numbers. However, the defense official admitted Russia had captured U.S.-made weapons. Michael Waltz stated that relying on Ukraine to track the weapons was not enough. That kind of eyes-on versus the self-reporting that's going on from the Ukrainian is incredibly important, he said. While Kyle claims there is no evidence of American weapons being stolen, CBS News and CNN reported Washington could not adequately track arms transferred to Kiev. Additionally, Western-made weapons have been spotted in the possession of the Azov Battalion, a neo-Nazi militia that was absorbed to Ukraine's National Guard. And we've also had Finland and Nigeria say that weapons from Ukraine have ended up in those countries illegally. So we also have the Pentagon, I'm going in a little bit more detail from something I mentioned in that article, admitting that Russia captured weapons in Ukraine. American weapons provided to Ukraine have been captured by Russia on the battlefield, a top Department of Defense official told Congress on Tuesday. Over the past year, Washington has provided Kiev with nearly $45 billion in military aid. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Powell claimed that Moscow was capturing American weapons and selling them on the black market. Our assessment that as some of these systems have been diverted is by the Russians, who have been capturing the things on the battlefield, which always happens. After Russian forces invaded Ukraine just over a year ago, the Joe Biden administration began providing Kiev with unprecedented weapons transfers. The U.S. has provided Ukraine with $44.3 billion in military assistance from January 24th, 2022 to January 15th, 2023, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. And this is a Western-based think tank that, made that assessment. Powell went on to assert that there is no evidence that has surfaced to suggest that Kiev was responsible for weapons finding their way to the black market. In the early months of the war, CNN reported that the U.S. lacked oversight over arms being sent to Ukraine. A source told the outlet in April, "We have fidelity for a short time, but when it enters the fog of war, we have almost zero. It drops into a big black hole, and you have no sense of it at all after a short period." That same month, James Auman, the founder and CEO of Blue Yellow, a Lithuanian-based organization that has been meeting with and supplying frontline units in Ukraine, told CBS News, this was reported in August, but he said it in April, all the stuff that goes across the border and then something happens, kind of like 30% of it reaches its final destination. In May, the Washington Post reported Ukraine is infamous for black market weapon sales. The U.S. government is well aware of the country's challenges with weapons proliferation, although it has been vague in describing the precautions it's taking. Powell was confronted by Congressman Matt Gaetz over the weapons ending up in the hands of neo-Nazis. Gaetz cited a 2018 article from Global Times that found American arms were being used in Ukraine by the Azov Battalion, a neo-Nazi militia that was absorbed into Ukraine's National Guard. Powell dismissed Gaetz's question by asserting the claim was Beijing's propaganda. And that's because the Global Times is a Chinese outlet. The Azov Battalion has been photographed with Western weapons, anti-tank missiles in particular. In March, NESTA tweeted a shipment of N-Log grenade launchers and instructions from #NATO countries arrived in Kharkiv. The Azov regiment was the first to learn about the new weaponry. The post included photos of Ukrainian soldiers wearing Nazi patches on their uniforms. In July, the Stimson Center, an American organization, warned U.S. arms could flow to avowed neo-Nazis. The Azov Battalion role in the key Ukrainian theaters creates a risk that the arms could be diverted to Azov's troops in contravention of U.S. law. Powell claimed the weapons were tracked by Ukraine with scanners provided by Washington. The data was transferred to American officials at the embassy in Kiev. He had that officers completed some inspections outside of the embassy. Additionally, Powell accused the White House discussed the White House's strategy for its proxy war in Ukraine. He said that the Department of Defense does not believe Russian forces will make significant territorial gains in the coming months. You may see small portions of territory change hands in the coming weeks and months, he told Congress. I do not think there is anything I see that suggests the Russians ran sweeping across Ukraine and that made significant territorial gains anytime in the next year or so. He explained that the Biden administration was committed to arming Ukraine, though the timetable for providing fighter jets was at least a year and a half. Powell added that the price tag to provide Kiev with F-16s was $11 billion, and the fighter jets was not one of Ukraine's top 3 priorities. So, I just want to mention this, Connor. I think everybody in the audience really understands what this means, but we do have the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg again saying that Ukraine will join NATO. This basically means that there's not a solution to the war in Ukraine on the horizon the longer the U.S. keeps saying that. And then one more article that I have here, I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute yesterday, March 1st. Washington seeks to drum up support for sanctions on China. The Joe Biden administration is pressuring allies to sanction China if Beijing decides to send arms to Russia. Reuters reported on Wednesday, top American officials have claimed the Chinese government is considering providing weapons for Moscow's war in Ukraine. According to the outlet, the talks on expanding the economic war with China are in the preliminary phase. It is unclear what sectors of Beijing's economy the U.S. will seek to blacklist. The White House hopes at least its allies in the Group of Seven will agree to sanction Beijing. In recent weeks, American officials have renewed accusations that Beijing could provide weapons to Moscow. On Friday, CNN reported three unnamed sources familiar with U.S. intelligence said China was considering sending drones and other arms, but no final decisions have been made. In March 2022, the U.S. claimed Russia requested weapons from China. A month later, NBC News reported those assertions were part of an information warfare campaign. Likewise, a charge that Russia had turned to China for providing military help lacked hard evidence, Ken Delinian wrote. The U.S. officials said there are no indications China is considering providing weapons to Russia. The Biden administration put that out as a warning to China not to do so, they said. The report continued. The European official described the disclosure as a public game to prevent any military support from China. Commenting on Washington's recent accusation, Reuters reported a European official said the U.S. had provided scant evidence to support their claims. American officials say they are giving allies detailed evidence. In recent meetings with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Secretary of State Antony Blinken threatened Washington would take action against Beijing if Chinese weapons are transferred to Russia. On Monday, Chinese officials said that U.S. claims were disinformation. The U.S. has been spreading disinformation about China supplying these weapons to Russia and using the allegation to sanction Chinese enterprises, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said. Beijing additionally accused Washington of setting a double standard. Mao declared, this is the spokesperson, on the Ukraine issue, China supports the objective and just position and actively promotes peace talks. The U.S., however, has been fanning the flames and fueling the fight with more weaponry. And with that, I just want to mention real quick, Connor has this great new article out today for the Libertarian Institute, The American People Must Draw Red Lines Now. It's going to be the spotlight this weekend at antiwar.com. So everybody take some time, go over either to the Institute or antiwar.com, find that article and read it. It's very important. Connor, what else you got?
All right, so this is sort of in line with that article, which is about how the people have to sort of stand up to Washington and some of these respective governments in NATO that are driving us toward nuclear war. We have to draw our own red lines is the idea, and it seems like some people are getting that same idea throughout Europe. So this is a piece I wrote with Will Porter on February 27th. It's called Stop the Killing, Major Anti-War Protests Held in Germany, France, and Italy. So a series of anti-war protests over the weekend saw Western European citizens en masse demanding their governments pursue diplomacy with Russia and halt arms shipments to Kiev. As the current conflict in Ukraine turned 1 year old, major demonstrations which saw people united across the political spectrum were seen in Germany, France, and Italy. 10,000 people gathered in Paris to protest against France's membership in both NATO as well as the EU. Attendees also demanded an end to the French government's military aid to Kiev. The demonstration, dubbed the National March for Peace, was organized by the right-wing La Patriots Party, according to the group's leader, Florian Philippot, who joined the Paris rally himself. Similar but smaller protests were held at 30 other locations throughout the country on Sunday, he said. And on Saturday, thousands of people participated in a peace demonstration in the Italian cities of Genoa and Milan. In Genoa, the rally focused on ending weapons shipments to Ukraine and was organized by union members as well as left-wing activists. The slogan of the protest was "Lower weapons, raise wages." 4,000 people from across Italy joined the Genoa protests along with people from France and Switzerland as well, according to local media reports. The collective autonomous port workers helped organize the rally with the Italian Communist Party. They demanded that the port of Genoa's facilities no longer be used to facilitate arms shipments to Ukraine to fuel the war. CALP, the union groups, one of their members, Riccardo Rudino, pointed out that the conflict in Ukraine did not begin last year, but rather in 2014 with the massacre of the Russian-speaking populations of the Donbass. And of course, following the U.S.-backed coup in Kiev in 2014, which overthrew the government of former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, but also a war was launched on the Russian-speaking regions in the Donbass and the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, where 14,000 people were killed, including thousands of civilians over the course of the next 8 years. In London, a large group carried out a similar demonstration calling for peace in Ukraine and an end to the British government's weapons transfers to Kiev as well. The event was held by the Stop the War Coalition at Portland Place in central London and was attended by former Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn. Many thousands of people participated in a massive protest in central Berlin, where attendees rallied against German military aid to Kiev. The protesters, who were massed at the Brandenburg Gate, demanded additionally that their government engage Russia in peace talks and bring the war in Ukraine to an end. The organizers said that as many as 50,000 people joined the Uprising for Peace demonstrations. However, the police offered a lower-end estimate of 13,000 people in attendance. The event was organized by Sarah Wagenknecht, a member of the Links Party, the Left Party in Germany, as well as a feminist author and campaigner named Alice Schwarzer. Wagenknecht declared that neo-Nazis were not welcome at the protest, but that anyone else who desired peace with an honest heart was welcome to attend. During her speech at the event, Wagenknecht declared that the creation of a new, strong peace movement, the protest sparked the creation of a new and strong peace movement in Germany. She also observed that the myriad protesters who were there were united by the fact that they do not feel represented by the government of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, nor his Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, in their decision to supply Kiev with weaponry, including main battle tanks. And of course, Baerbock had the notorious quote recently where she said, "We are at war with Russia." In a reference to the drastic escalation of Berlin's involvement in the war since last year, some banners read, "Helmets today, tanks tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, your sons." Other banners carried by protesters bore such anti-war slogans as "Stop the killing," "Not my war, not my government," and "Diplomats instead of grenades." 2 weeks prior to that protest, Wagenknecht and Schwarzer published a manifest for peace, which demanded that Scholz stop the escalation in weapons deliveries. The petition, reportedly at the time we wrote the article, had garnered already more than 650,000 signatures, including reportedly some prominent intellectuals and political figures. This weekend's massive protests in Berlin followed a smaller demonstration at the end of January in Nuremberg, where participants rallied against Scholz's decision to provide Leopard 2 battle tanks to Kiev. This month, around 10,000 people also protested in Munich during the Munich Security Conference, where Western leaders, of course, discussed funding, arming, and training Kiev as long as it takes to defeat Russia. And also on Sunday in southwestern Germany, protesters gathered at the Ramstein Air Base, the U.S. Air Base, where the Ukraine Defense Contacts Group's meetings on arming Kiev are routinely held. I believe the last meeting there was in January. But the people there were calling for an end to the weapons deliveries, demanding the U.S. Air Force go home, and demanding that Julian Assange be freed. In Nuremberg, protesters expressed their dire concerns that the German people were being dragged into another war with Russia. As one demonstrator commented, "If we Germans get involved in the war, and I personally do not have a war with Russia, then for us Germans, based on history, it is the worst sign that we can send." The demonstrator continued, "No war must go through Germany, neither with arms deliveries nor anything else, because otherwise Germany will be in the middle of it again." He said he believes this is just what America wants. So, of course, the latest protests in Germany take place against the backdrop of veteran investigative journalist Seymour Hersh's bombshell report, How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline. Before the war began, Russia provided roughly a third of Europe's gas, while Germany depended on Moscow for more than half of its gas supplies. And after the Nord Stream pipelines were sabotaged, Putin offered to ship gas to Europe via an undamaged line in Nord Stream 2. This offer was quickly rejected by Berlin. Of course, we all remember Secretary of State Antony Blinken celebrating the blasts in the Baltic Sea, which, according to Hersh, were caused by explosives planted by U.S. Navy divers and detonated with a sonar buoy dropped by a Norwegian spy plane. Blinken described the attack as a tremendous strategic opportunity to wean Europe finally off its dependency on cheap Russian energy, quote, for the years to come. Since the attack, which led to possibly the largest ever leak of methane gas, the U.S. and Norway have taken Russia's place as Europe's top natural gas suppliers. As a result of the economic war on Russia led by the U.S., people across Europe have suffered skyrocketing gas prices and inflation, leaving some struggling to heat their homes during the frigid winter months. The strain is beginning to show, likely playing some role in motivating the spate of protest actions in recent days. We covered last year, tens of thousands of people attended similar demonstrations in Italy, Germany, and France, as well as the Czech Republic, with many voicing outrage over just how much money was going to Ukraine as their living standards were plummeting at the same time. All right. So this next one we have is from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com from the 26th. So we have William Burns, the CIA director, saying, no, Iran is not resuming a nuclear weapons program. So in a CBS interview over the weekend, CIA Director William Burns offered an assessment which, coming from U.S. officials, would be a huge admission and potentially of much consequence. Burns reported Iran is not resuming its nuclear weapons program, which it ended decades ago, and has made no decisions on even attempting to. The U.S. has long been vague on whether or not Iran is really trying to make arms. Iran says they aren't and has ruled out ever doing so on religious grounds. And analysts have also been concluding for years that Iran is not actively trying to make atomic weapons. In fact, Gareth Porter has done so much great work on this, proving how there really never was. Even though the intelligence community claims as much of that is based off of Israeli propaganda and Mujahideen cult forgeries, that basically there's really no evidence that Iran, and there's so many inaccuracies in these documents that it's pretty clear that Iran they were never pursuing nuclear weapons. Of course, it's like we said, it's been deemed haram by both ayatollahs, and there's been no change of that policy. And they've never been found to be violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty either in 53 years. So having the U.S. spy chief make such a public admission should portend a policy shift back toward diplomacy with Iran. It may also lead to backlash from nations like Israel and Saudi Arabia, who want spurious allegations against Iran to continue being treated as impediments to such diplomacy. And such nations accuse Iran of things left and right and strongly prefer the U.S. endorsing their accusations. Accusing Iran of nuclear arms development is the lifeblood of Israel's aid demands, and now the U.S. CIA chief is contradicting these allegations. So U.S. ambiguity often depends on misinterpreting the facts of Iran's civilian program, and Burns continues to struggle with facts, falsely claiming Iran is now enriching uranium to 84%, but this is just a few particles that were found recently. And in reality, Iran's enrichment maxes out at 60% with their uranium hexafluoride, and the production of a few particles enriched to 84% was an accidental result of configuring enrichment centrifuges. Even there, the production was well short of weapons grade and not a proliferation risk. So even being mistaken on that fact, it was possible for the CIA to conclude that there is no active weapons program. And then we have this next one from Jason Ditz on February 28th about this new IAEA report that says that inspectors found some in uranium particles enriched to 83.7%. A new International Atomic Energy Agency report was leaked on Tuesday, stating that the IAEA inspectors found uranium at 83.7% enrichment in Iran. An unspecified number of such particles were found. The report confirmed that Iran is not stockpiling any uranium enriched to more than 60% purity. The last part is important, as the weapons grade enrichment is 90% or more, meaning there is still no weapons threat. Efforts are being made to explain the new particles, but Iran has suggested that they accidentally formed during cascade configurations. The IAEA appears to accept that explanation, so hopefully this will turn out to be a non-issue. Although it is being exploited quite a bit in the media right now, there's these unverified claims so far made by John Kirby and other American officials and in the media that Russia is going to provide Iran with S-400 air defense systems, and that if they get those combined with this enrichment, and we're going to get to this in a moment here, Colin Cowell's comments that are incorrect about the extent to how advanced Iran's nuclear program is and how they're at a huge proliferation risk right now. All these things are being used to basically say that Israel has a limited amount of time to launch an attack on Iran if the U.S. won't. And so we're seeing quite a bit more hawkishness in the media this week with respect to Iran. So this is from Jason Ditz again on March 1st. U.S. official falsely claims Iran is 12 days from nuke material production. Speaking to the U.S. House Armed Services Committee, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Colin Cowell, falsely testified that Iran could make enough weapons-grade uranium for a bomb in about 12 days. Cowell claims that Iran's enrichment capacity has increased sufficiently over the course of the past 5 years since the U.S. abandoned the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, to reduce that timeline from more like a year, and regrets that the JCPOA is, quote, on ice. Other officials concede that Iran is not stockpiling any uranium enriched beyond 60%, well short of weapons grade, and also doubt Iran's technical capabilities to build nuclear weapons. Getting a bomb's worth of 90% uranium is no small task, even before trying to make it into a deliverable weapon. Iran's weapons development capabilities would be in doubt even if they were stockpiling uranium, which again, they aren't. Pentagon officials still maintain that getting back into a deal with Iran is preferable to not having one. So again, it looks like they're slightly less hawkish, though, than the State Department, who seem adamantly against the JCPOA and the possibility of there being any diplomacy in the near future with Iran over their co-belligerence in the war in Ukraine, or what they're alleging is evidence of co-belligerence. So now Trita Parsi wrote this really great article at Responsible Statecraft the other week that I wanted to cover on the show. He's been making the case for a little bit more than a year now that we are closer to war with Iran under Biden's administration than we have been even under Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George W. Bush. And it does seem like it's getting worse now. So I wanted to call attention to some of the things that some of the statements he's picked up from U.S. officials to indicate that there may be a policy shift where the American administration is no longer just opposing and acting to prevent an Israeli attack on Iran. So he says, as all eyes were on Ukraine and the Chinese balloons in the sky, the Biden administration seemingly shifted America's longstanding opposition to Israel, starting a disastrous war with Iran. So this is U.S. Ambassador to Israel Tom Nides speaking to the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations on Sunday, or this is a couple weeks ago, but saying that Israel can and should do whatever they need to do to deal with in regards to Iran, and we've got their back, a thinly veiled reference to military action. And these comments do not appear to be outliers. After Israel struck a defense facility in Iran on January 29th, the Biden administration uncharacteristically hinted to reporters that the Israeli operation was part of a new joint effort by the U.S. and Israel to contain Tehran's nuclear and military ambitions. So when Blinken was asked about it a day later, he offered no criticism of the attack and no concerns for the destabilizing potential of the strikes, let alone a condemnation. He offered what amounts to be a defense and a justification of the Israeli strike. He said, "It is very important that we continue to deal with and work against, as necessary, the various actions that Iran is engaged in throughout the region and beyond that threaten peace and security." A senior Biden administration official told Trita that this does not signify a major shift in policy. But Trita says, without a public walkback, such assurances leave much to be desired. From George W. Bush to Barack Obama to even Donald Trump, the U.S. government sought to prevent Israel from bombing Iran, since Washington risked getting sucked into that war, and the end result would most likely be a severely destabilized Middle East and Iran with a nuclear weapon. Bush Jr. refused to sell Israel specialized bunker-busting bombs and denied giving Israeli leaders a green light to bomb Iran in 2008, effectively blocking the Israeli plan, although Dick Cheney had other ideas, but it seems he was overruled. President Obama made his opposition to an Israeli strike public, telling CNN in 2009 that he is absolutely not giving Israel a green light to attack Iran. The fear of a surprise Israeli attack was so significant during the Obama years that a senior Pentagon official asked to have the moon cycle included in his daily intelligence brief, since a unilateral Israeli attack was deemed more likely to occur during particular moon phases. At one point, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton took the unusual step of going to the podium in 2012 to condemn Israel's assassination of an Iranian scientist due to its potentially destabilizing consequences. And you can just contrast that with the massive, unprecedented assassination campaign carried out in Iran last year, where they killed like 6 people in the span of like 2 months, including a very high-ranking senior colonel in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It looks like there were MEK assassins on motorcycles who just shot him up in his car in his driveway. And then next thing you know, they were ramping up the drone strikes and killing people in the aeronautics industry and attacking military facilities as well. And so uh, he says that when the Israelis pushed American presidents to take military action, various elements of the U.S. government pushed back, even under Donald Trump. According to Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu urged Trump to strike against Iran after he had lost the 2020 election. Milley resisted, telling Trump at one point, "If you do this, you're going to have an effing war." A lot has clearly changed in the past years and months. Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. Biden promised to return to it, but of course has ramped up sanctions and expressed support for the protesters in the country. And we've had, as I said, the Israelis ramping up their sabotage campaign and their assassination campaign. And so he says power in Iran has shifted back to conservative hardliners now who, I disagree with this, but fumbled the nuclear talks while increasing the regime's repression of the Iranian people. I think if you have a dishonest broker here in the negotiations, it's kind of hard to succeed. But then this led to widespread protests and the most significant challenge to the clerical regime in more than a decade. One thing hasn't changed, however: war with Iran will be disastrous for the region and for the Iranian people's struggle for freedom and dignity. But this appears to be the direction the Biden team is going, perhaps inadvertently, by caving to Israel's longstanding position to deal with Iran's nuclear program militarily rather than diplomatically. Netanyahu has been caught on tape recently boasting that he was who convinced Trump to quit the Iran nuclear deal. And this does fit a pattern in which one area where Biden has most consistently followed Trump's Middle East policy has been on Israel. Biden has refused to reverse all major policy shifts in favor of Israel that Trump put in place, from moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem to recognizing Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, to embracing and seeking to expand the Abraham Accords, a measure that put the final nail in the coffin of the two-state solution by explicitly moving beyond the Israeli-Palestinian conflict rather than seeking to resolve it. And despite his Trump-like deference to Israel, or perhaps precisely because of it, Israel's Minister of Diaspora Affairs did not mince words, slamming the U.S. when U.S. Ambassador Nides issued a benign criticism of plans to weaken Israel's justice system. They said, "Mind your own business," and he later tweeted it as well. And ironically, Trita says that is good advice. And America that minds its own business and prioritizes its own interests would not only stop undermining its own credibility by condemning Russian illegal annexations while enabling Israeli ones, but would block any Israeli attempt to drag America into a disastrous war in the Middle East. It says perhaps Biden should take to heart the true meaning of Minister Chikili's dismissive advice. So, I mean, it's just important to keep an eye out on this. As I say, they're ramping up the arguments in the case being made that there's just a much more narrow window and that Israel needs to act now, and that that they're tying up Russia and Iran together as being co-belligerents in Ukraine and also a threat to Israel as well by extension. And so we now have this piece is about Syria and just really shows you how callous our Congress is and how useless they are. But there was the House overwhelmingly approved a resolution to maintain sanctions on Syria even after this earthquake, where we've seen UN experts and the head of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent coming out and demanding that sanctions be lifted because it's impeding relief efforts horribly. And so it's important to just check this out. So Representative Joe Wilson, a Republican from South Carolina, introduced a bill to basically double down on support for the Caesar Act sanctions, which prevent which prevents Syria from being able to rebuild after the war. So the House this week voted overwhelmingly in favor of this resolution to maintain sanctions on Syria following this devastating earthquake that killed almost 6,000 people in the country. The resolution was introduced by Representative Joe Wilson. As I said, 51 co-sponsors. It passed by 414-2, with only Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene voting against the measure. It calls for the Biden administration to remain committed to implementing the Syria Civilian Protection Act of 2019, a law that imposed crippling sanctions on Syria that are designed to prevent the country from rebuilding after years of war. They specifically target the engineering and construction sectors to make sure that Syria remains in rubble. The resolution said that the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was falsely claiming U.S. sanctions impeded the aid response to the earthquake, but it's a fact that U.S. sanctions hurt the relief effort, something that has been detailed by UN experts and the head of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. After initially claiming sanctions would not hurt the relief effort, the Biden administration issued a 180-day sanctions exemption for transactions related to earthquake relief. UN experts responded by welcoming the move, but said it wasn't enough and called for sanctions to be fully lifted. The House resolution said that it mourned the victims of the earthquake and portrayed enforcing the Caesar Act as a way to protect the Syrian people. But even before the earthquake, U.S. sanctions on Syria were having a devastating impact on the civilian population. Of course, Antony Blinken acknowledged last year, in October of 2021, that the U.S. policy is to oppose the reconstruction of Syria, and the policy hasn't changed. And obviously, the sanctions are a huge part of that. So, Business Insider covered Green and Massey voting against the resolution, but they completely mischaracterized the bill and said that the two of them were voting against mourning the people killed in the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. They made no mention of the fact that it was about supporting the sanctions on Syria. The Biden administration has said it's against regional countries upgrading ties with the Assad government, even if it's in part of an effort to aid the earthquake relief. And on top of the sanctions opposing Syria's engagement with its neighbors, of course, the U.S. occupies a third of the country, backing the Kurdish-led SDF and stealing Syria's oil resources. And that's the area where the majority of their oil and wheat resources are. And it's important to remember that last fall, months before the earthquakes, Alina Duhan, a UN special rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, made the following comments after a 12-day visit to Syria last fall, months prior to the earthquake. She said, "In the current dramatic and still deteriorating humanitarian situation, as 12 million Syrians grapple with food insecurity, I urge the immediate lifting of all unilateral sanctions that severely harm human rights and prevent any efforts for early recovery, rebuilding, and reconstruction," she told the UN Security Council. She also said the catastrophic effects of unilateral sanctions are impacting people across all walks of life in the country. She said 90% of Syria's civilian population is living in poverty and has limited access to food, water, electricity, shelter, fuel, transportation, healthcare, including medicine and medical equipment. So there was virtually unanimous support for maintaining those people in those conditions indefinitely until there is regime change. And they already, of course, backed this CIA dirty war against Damascus, the U.S. and its allies, including Saudi Arabia and Israel and Turkey, which killed 500,000 people. And it's going to cost hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild the country, but we're preventing them being able to do business with anybody in the outside world except these countries that are also on the sanctions blacklist, as we've discussed before. But there's been tons of reports coming out that even China and Russia have a difficult time investing in Syria because of the sanctions. So it's just absolutely deplorable. But you can't expect anything more.
All right, Connor, that's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you so much for all the great info, and we'll be back with more shows next week.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everybody.